So roughly, Trump's got 2 months before the nomination deadline ends. He really wants an accomplishment by the end of the year. Now, I know that's hard for some to understand who think the U.S. president should think in strategic terms and policy terms, which I grant most Americans would like. That's not the way Trump thinks.
We can talk now to Donald Trump's former national security advisor, Ambassador John Bolton. Good afternoon to you, Ambassador.
Hi, how are you? Glad to be with you.
It's good to have you here. Can I ask you straight away, and first of all, Ambassador, do you see a clear plan, a strategy, a coherent strategy in the Trump administration's approach to the search for a deal in Ukraine? And if you can you just describe it to us?
No, I don't think there is a clear plan. I think what you've seen in the past 4 or 5 days, as press reports have covered how this came about, the confusion, the lack of coordination, the incoherence of what one may loosely call decision making in the Trump administration. I don't think there's any way really to have a clear idea how this will unfold, but I do think there's one key element here that should inform your listeners as they try and evaluate what may come next, which is Trump doesn't care about any of the points in this plan in terms of U.S. national security interest, Ukrainian interest, Russian interest. Trump wants a deal. He wants a deal because he thinks that will help getting the Nobel Peace Prize. Why is he in a hurry? Because the rules of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee say that to get the prize in any given year, you have to be nominated by January 31st of that year. So roughly, Trump's got 2 months before the nomination deadline ends. He really wants an accomplishment by the end of the year. Now, I know that's hard for some to understand who think the U.S. president should think in strategic terms and policy terms, which I grant most Americans would like. That's not the way Trump thinks. And therefore, trying to evaluate this incoherence in the team that he's put together and how they're performing is because they don't know what his preferences are either.
It is, as you say, Ambassador, an extraordinary thought, even after, well, a full term and now a short period of a second term, to hear it said that the President of the United States is wholly motivated when it comes to the war in Ukraine by the desire for a certificate, by a medal to put on his mantle shelf. But you seem completely sincere that that is the extent of his ambition.
Well, if anybody else can come up with a coherent strategy that he's actually following, I'd love to hear it. You know, his supporters often say he's engaged in complex game of three-dimensional chess. I can just tell you from my own personal observation, that's simply not the case. And the way this plan was put together, let's just take one example. Let's see what the Secretary of State of the United States said, who, by the way, is also simultaneously the National Security Advisor. On Saturday morning, he called a bipartisan group of U.S. senators at a conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and said, this is basically a Russian plan, which made them happy to hear because they were disturbed the U.S. would have put such a plan forward. By the end of the day on Saturday, Rubio was saying, no, actually, it's our plan after all, which helps to show he was not involved in the negotiations that led to the document. He came from behind, and I think on Sunday in Geneva, did a lot of important work to try to pull this back into reality. But this is no way to run the U.S. government, and there's no sign it's going to change in the near future.
Well, I mean, again, it is it's not unfamiliar as an analysis, but it is still really, really striking. Look, Vladimir Zelensky is due in Washington within a matter of days. He is suggesting he feels more optimistic about the possibilities for that meeting and the possibility of a deal to place before Vladimir Putin. Now, if Putin is not willing to compromise, is not willing to move back from his absolutist demands of taking territory that his troops have not been able to take, of absolutely ruling out membership of NATO, of no foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, and so on, do you believe, Ambassador, that President Trump could or would decide to apply very much more serious pressure, economic pressure, on Putin than he has so far?
Well, I don't think you can rule it out. He did put new sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, two of the major Russian oil export companies, and that could have a significant impact on Russian revenues used to conduct the war. But I think it's more likely that he'll simply back out of this effort, which is if your scenario plays out, will show that his latest gambit isn't succeeding either.
Yeah. I mean, there is a bill, isn't there, in Congress? It hasn't gone to any vote, but it seems to have very heavy cross-party support. 80 members of the Senate, apparently, who want to pass a piece of legislation that would open the way to very heavy secondary sanctions on countries doing business with Russia. Now, I read reports that the bill has been tweaked. It's been rewritten to turn what would have been a requirement into a discretion for the president. I wonder if that's significant. Does that open the door to President Trump not taking action as opposed to taking action?
Well, it's customary for the executive branch in the United States. This goes back well over 50 years. Congress writes all kinds of policy about American national security. And typically, in almost every piece of legislation, there are provision that says the president may waive the provisions of this statute if he deems it in the national interest, because otherwise presidents tend to veto that sort of legislation because they think they should have control of foreign policy. So I think it just puts that piece of legislation back into the normal practice.
Yes.
The reason it hasn't come to the floor of the Senate is very clear. Trump doesn't want it to come to the floor of the Senate. Right. And as long as this current peace plan is being negotiated, I think it's very unlikely he'll want any further pressure put on the Russians.
Right. And yet we see opinion polls which suggest that the Republican Party support for Ukraine, and so do the American public. Would President Trump choose to go against that current of opinion?
Well, it's interesting because support in the Republican Party has actually been rising over the past several months, support for Ukraine, which I think is the party coming back to its position. But we have here also J.D. Vance, the vice president, playing a fairly significant role, apparently, in this negotiation. And he is probably Ukraine's least enthusiastic supporter among the entire top administration. That's just more evidence of confusion.
Evidence of confusion. Ambassador John Bolton, as always, thank you.
President of the United States and First Lady Melania Trump.
I've also ended 8 wars in 9 months, and we're working on that final war. It's not easy, but I don't know. I think we're going to get there. 25,000 soldiers, Ukraine, Russia. In the last month, 25,000 soldiers have died. So I think we're getting very close to a deal. We'll find out. I thought that one would have been gone quicker. We did 8. I thought that would have been an easier one, but I think we're making progress.